Washington Journal continues.
And joining us now is Robert Jones. He's the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute and author of The End of White Christian America. He's here to discuss his book, which deals how the United States is no longer a majority white Christian nation and how this change has altered the politics and social values of our country. Robbie, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So before we get started, explain to our viewers exactly what the Public Religion Research Institute is.
Yes, so we go by our acronym often too. You may see it as PRRI, but we are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit research organization that specializes in doing mostly public opinion research at this intersection of culture and religion and politics.
Okay, and your book asks the question, is it the end of white Christian America? Exactly what do you mean by white Christian America?
Yeah, well, it may be helpful to start with what I don't mean. I don't mean the end of all white Christians in the country. There's plenty of counter evidence to that claim, nor do I mean the end of all white Christian churches in the country. But what I do mean, and what the book is really talking about, is this cultural shift that we've had in the country. And when I use the word white Christian America, what I mean is this really dominant cultural edifice that was built primarily by white Protestants, in fact, in the country, not even white Catholics, but white Protestants. So if you think back of this, kind of stereotype of the cultural center of the country as being white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, this kind of waspy cultural center. It's that cultural center that I'm talking about that we really have seen the end of as the country has grown more and more diverse. And in fact, one of the kind of key findings that in the book is that we have in fact already moved from being just demographically, we have gone just over the last 8 years from being a majority white Christian nation. So we go back just to 2008. 54% of the country is white and Christian. Today, that number is 43%. So just over the last 2 election cycles, we've actually crossed this threshold from being a majority white Christian nation to a minority white Christian nation.
And it's a chart here from PRRY looking at white Christian country and saying how that is now a minority. Here it shows 43% of the country is made up of white Christians, where there's 24% non-white Christians, and 23% unaffiliated, and others with other religions or who don't know or refused to say. Now, in what ways have we seen a change in the cultural paradigm based on the diminishing numbers of white Protestants in the United States?
Yeah. Well, the other sort of big wedge you see there is this big wedge of the religiously unaffiliated. And that's been kind of the other end of the story, right, is that as the number of white Christians have come down, part of that is it's an immigration story and the changing ethnic composition of the country. But the other piece of that is that white Christians are disaffiliating, particularly young people are disaffiliating from Christian churches. That has actually accelerated this trend. So in fact, today, nearly a quarter of Americans claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. And if you look at younger people, it is nearly 4 in 10 young people who claim no religious affiliation today. And most of that shift has really come from white Christians in the country.
Okay, let's take a look at an excerpt from your book that says, the American demographic, cultural, and religious landscape is being remade. But while the country's shifting racial dynamics alone are certainly a source of apprehension for many white Americans, it is the disappearance of white Christian America that is driving their strong, sometimes apocalyptic reactions, falling numbers, and the marginalization of the once dominant racial and religious identity, one that has been central not just to white Christians themselves, but to the national mythos threatens white Christians' understanding of America itself. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, I think for so long, being white and Christian has been central to what it has meant to be American. I'll give you just one example. I received right after Barack Obama's re-election. I have this photo in the book actually, but I received this email, and it had this black and white photo of a white Christian family at prayer around the Thanksgiving table, and it was a lament about losing a kind of white Christian culture with the re-election of our first African American president. And I think for many, Barack Obama was a symbol of this changing, landscape. The rising number of Latinos and people who are speaking Spanish is a kind of realization. And I think the other thing is that many older white Christians are looking at their pews and seeing that the sea of heads that they look out over is more and more gray. And so kind of lower numbers of young people as younger people are leaving white Christian churches.
Okay, we are talking with Robert Jones about his new book, The End of White Christian America. Republicans can call 202-748-8001. Democrats 202-748-8000. Independents 202-748-8002. Now, the book talks about white Christians, but you focus on Protestants. Why leave out Catholics from this equation? What's the difference there?
Well, I don't completely leave them out, but the driving cultural force here has been the world of white Protestantism. And so if you remember, if you just go back, to mid-century, mid-20th century, it would not be, in the 1950s, it would not be unusual, for example, to go to a country club and see a sign, or at least in the policies, the people who were not allowed in those country clubs were African Americans, Jews, and Catholics. So Catholics have often, in fact, been excluded from this story, and only recently have those barriers between white Protestants and white Catholics actually come down.
Okay, and you talked about age a little bit as another chart here from PRRI that talks about white Christians by age, and it shows a pretty stark differences when you look at people over the age of 65. That 65% are white Christian, but by the time you get down to the millennials, the folks between 18 and 29, it's less than a quarter of them identify that way. Tell us what's happening here.
Well, I like to think about this chart as kind of an archaeological dig down through generational strata, is one way to kind of think about it, and as you dig down, you see this stark, it's linear. I mean, you can take a ruler and draw a line through these generational trends, and that's just the snapshot of Americans who are living today by generation. So that is a lot of change in just a few generations' time, from only a quarter of younger people identifying as white and Christian to 2/3 of seniors. And I think this is a clue as to why this has sent some shockwaves through American culture, because it is a demographic trend that's happened very, very quickly.
And talking about the demographic trend, in the last hour we were talking about the effects of immigration on the country. Is that a part of it? Is it because fewer people are identifying as Christian? Is it that there are fewer whites, or is it a combination of the both?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. I mean, certainly immigration has been a factor, although what's interesting is that net immigration over the last few years has actually been flat or even negative. So it hasn't, in the last few years, been the accelerant. But one thing's not talked about a lot is birth rates. So lower birth rates among whites compared to non-whites in the country. But again, the thing that really pours fuel on this fire and accelerates this trend is actually something internal to white churches, and that is young people leaving those white churches and becoming becoming religiously unaffiliated.
Okay, Robert Jones, the founding CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute, is here talking to us about his book, The End of White Christian America. And Sam's calling in from Thousand Oaks, California, on our independent line. Hi, Sam.
Yes, good morning. Thank you so much for taking my call, and happy holidays to both of you. And I chose the word happy holidays because I'm neither white nor Christian. So my religion, Hinduism, this is really not the holiday season for us. Diwali happened in October, November. And it's just something that I pointed out because we had a holiday office party, and that was just a couple of days ago, whereas our holiday season was actually a couple of months ago. So with that context in mind, I'm wondering, in your book, sir, did you examine the growth of, I know you have a category, other religions. Did you specifically call out religions such as Sikhism or Hinduism? And it's important in the modern day context because a lot of Sikhs get misidentified as Muslims because of the turban, etc. So I'll take your answer offline. Thank you.
Great. So where you would find Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, or in that wedge that we were talking about of other religions in the country, that group has been growing, not dramatically, but it has been growing in the country over the last few decades. One of the challenges really with public opinion research is that in your typical, political poll or public opinion poll has about 1,000 people in it. So if you've got a group that makes up 1% of the population, or even 2%, even Jews, for example, make up 2% of the country. There's never quite enough in a particular poll to really break them out for analysis. So it's one of the real challenges of public opinion research as we have growing numbers, but they're not quite big enough to be captured with quantitative studies unless they're a specialized study focusing on that group that is very, very expensive, and those are few and far between. But I'll take one cue from the holiday party thing, though, because I think it goes to the cultural divides that we're feeling in the country and the defensiveness that I think many white Christians are feeling around this. So we, at PRI, we just put out a poll last week about this very thing. Do we say Happy Holidays? Do we say Merry Christmas? And this kind of, so-called war on Christmas that kind of gets revved up every year about this time. What that's about really is this changing demographics that you not quite sure whether you can say Merry Christmas to everyone on the street in the way that I think it was easier to assume previously. But we found the country divided right down the middle on whether, for example, on the question of whether store clerks should greet customers with Merry Christmas or whether they should greet customers with Happy Holidays out of respect for those who aren't celebrating holidays at this time. And then I think key to this is, the way this falls out in our politics, is that Republicans and Democrats are on opposite ends of this spectrum. 2/3 of Democrats say we should use Happy Holidays out of respect for those who don't celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah at the holidays, and then 2/3 of Republicans say no, we should say Merry Christmas.
So let's talk a little bit about the intersection with politics of this. As we've often discussed on this show, white Protestants made up a big part of the electorate who helped propel Donald Trump to a presidential victory. At the same time, according to another PRI chart, it talks about how the percentage of people who voted for a Democratic presidential candidate over the past several cycles, and whereas black Protestants are voting as much as 95% for that in recent years. On the other end, you have white evangelical Protestants who vote less than 1/4% of the time in recent election. Talk about that political dynamic.
Well, one of the things you'll note from that chart, which has the last several elections cycles on it, is kind of its consistency, right? So it doesn't change that much from year to year. It looks pretty stable. And that's pretty remarkable given that the candidates that have been running in those have been very, very different. And yet it's party that really provides the stability. But one remarkable thing to me is that since Reagan, if you want a shorthand for understanding the religious landscape in politics, it's essentially this, that white Christian groups tend to lean toward or strongly support Republican candidates and everybody else in the country, non-white Christians, non-Christian religious groups, the religiously unaffiliated, lean toward or strongly support Democratic candidates. So that's the kind of divide we've been living with really since Reagan. As the Democratic Party became the party of civil rights, whites in the South in particular went to the Republican Party, and that's the divide we've been living with all this time.
All right, Ruth is calling in from Houston, Texas, on our Democratic line. Ruth, you are on with Robert Jones.
Praise the Lord and good morning. I am a minister and a person who loves Jesus Christ, and I don't feel that we should honor anybody else's religion for as whether we say Merry Christmas or Happy Holiday. That part I do. However, I do want to say that it is laughable about Mr. Robert Jones. Why don't they just say Ku Klux Klan, period? Instead of just, there's no such thing as a white Christian or a black Christian. And I'm a Jew, as I'm in the brown skin, but I'm a Jew because I have been grafted into the kingdom of the living God. So you can't be a real Christian sitting up there talking about white, because color has nothing to do with God.
Okay, let's let Mr. Jones respond.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I hear this kind of theological point a fair amount. I appreciate that the caller making this argument. However, as a social scientist, when you actually look at the behavior of Christians in the country, one of the reasons why virtually every social scientist and political scientist that studies the religious landscape does kind of sort the religious landscape using race and religious identification is because the political behavior and the political beliefs and values of white Christians are very, very different than African American Christians or Latino Christians or Asian Pacific Islander Christians. And it is actually, one of the, I think, really interesting pieces of the American landscape of how very, very similar beliefs, for example, like African American Protestants and white evangelical Protestants share, I would say, 3/4 of their theological beliefs, like the virgin birth, a literal view of the Bible, these kinds of things, a literal heaven and hell, are all shared. But when it gets refracted through the experience of race, they go to very different places in terms of public policy. And that's been really true in the country. I would say for those who are ministers, like the previous caller, noting that difference, I think, does raise some pretty interesting and perhaps troubling theological questions as to kind of why that is.
Okay. At a post-election campaign forum last month, GOP pollster Bill McInturf discussed the shrinking number of white Americans and race overall in the election, in the 2016 election. Let's take a look at what he said.
Well, look, more than half the kids being born in the country today, and younger kids are non-white. They're going to be aging into the electorate. This country will be going through an incredibly sharp change. We have today, according to the U.S. Census, the highest number of people born outside the country since 1880. We have the highest number of people speaking a language other than English in literally the last 80 years. Now, I believe in the American ideal. I believe America is founded on a principle, and we are, as a country, infinitely stronger because of this incredibly influx of new people. But guess what's happened in every wave of immigration in this country? Every wave has led to tension, social tension, dislocation, kind of a battle as we assimilate people. The Italians, the Irish, every wave of immigration. And guess what has been the happy outcome over a generation, which is our country's capacity to assimilate people and to function as a nation. I believe that will happen over time, and I think we're watching the same dislocation that took place at each different time of these immigration waves. And I think there is a right side to history, and the right side of history is no party is going to survive in this country for very long as a white party. And if you do not find a way to have some inclusive message and some capacity to motivate people around these divisions, you're not going to survive as a majority party.
So talk a little bit about that, not only in terms of political power, but just in terms of cultural power in America. If this is a shrinking group, isn't it more important to focus more broadly?
Yeah, what's interesting about this is, so this is a Republican pollster talking, and one of the things I note in the book is exactly this point. I mean, the Republicans themselves in 2012, when Mitt Romney lost, went through this soul-searching process and kind of determined exactly what Bill's saying here, that unless they broaden the tent, the long-term future of the party was really at stake. And in fact, what you see is, if you go all the way back to the 90s to the present, Republican presidential candidates have whether they win or they lose, their coalitions are made up of about 80% white Christian voters, and that's even as those proportions of those groups have been declining. So they've been remaining reliant on a shrinking group of voters, whereas Democrats have been moving with the times. So Bill Clinton's coalition in the 1990s, for example, was about 2/3 white and Christian, but Barack Obama's winning coalition in 2012 was only 37% white and Christian. So this gap between the two parties has become enormous. And I, along with most other pollsters, was really skeptical that another Republican candidate like Donald Trump could run a campaign that really did double down on white Christian voters as a winning strategy. But I do liken this to kind of a Hail Mary pass. It was a highly unlikely event that nonetheless occurred. But what that means, though, is that I think Bill is right here, it's not a long-term strategy, right? So if you win your final football game by just throwing a Hail Mary, 50-yard Hail Mary pass into the end zone and your guy happens to catch it, you really don't want to hold on to that as your play for the next playoff game, right? That's a very unlikely strategy for a long-term success.
Okay, Rachel is calling in from Asheville, North Carolina on our Republican line. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, how are you doing?
We are great. You're on with Robert Jones.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say I come from a kind of unusual viewpoint. I didn't endorse Donald Trump. I really appreciated the Christian preacher, Martin Luther King Jr. I thought it was really awesome, his words. The last words in Memphis, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, because that really is intense, because God is a God of justice and truth. But saying all that, my one comment, and he can comment on it if he wants, I really wonder if there's less white Christians because they've been martyred. And that's really what I wonder. And I think it's really sad that people haven't been taught right about, what God is really about.
All right, let's let Robert Jones respond.
Yeah. So thank you for that comment. I think if by martyred we mean literally killed, then I don't think we have much evidence for that. What we do have great amount of evidence for is again that young people have essentially been looking for the exits of churches, and there's a couple of factors in that. We've actually asked young people who were raised religious and then left. And by the way, most of them leave before the age of 20, so it's a very early decision, those who left. And when we asked them kind of why they left, we basically hear a couple of things. One is they said they stopped believing in kind of the supernatural teachings of the religion, so the virgin birth, a literal creation, those kinds of things. It's the kind of religious teachings or dogma that they've stopped believing. So it's a belief issue. But the other thing that comes up is, particularly among young people, more than a third of young people say that a very important reason why they left was because of negative teachings or negative treatment of gay or lesbian people. And so particularly among conservative white churches, that's been a real point of tension with the younger generation that's very, very supportive of gay rights.
Okay, up next we have James calling in from Collins, Mississippi on our independent line. James, you're on with Robert Jones.
Yes, good morning. How are you all doing?
We're doing good.
Yeah,
Go
good
ahead,
morning.
James.
Mr. Robert, what is your denomination?
Sir, interesting. So I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, not far from you, and grew up Southern Baptist.
Okay. I hear you say that this particular race is beginning to decline, but isn't that true for most of the denominations? A lot of them are beginning to decline, and also the decline is not necessarily because of the person is the denomination of white, because a lot of those very people that you're talking about, they're so tired of the fraud and the hypocrisy that goes on in these religions, organizations, and a lot of them are just fed up with it. And it's not just white, as you say, but there's African Americans, there are Hispanics, there's you name it. They're tired of being labeled rather than being filled with the Holy Spirit. And the teachings that goes on in these churches that the young people are turning away from, quote unquote, what you're saying, into Satanism, into all these other organizations that does not worship like the gospel. They're worshiping all other kind of things, and that's because of the way that you're approaching this conversation, talking about white. It's like you're putting racism in it.
All right, James, let's give Robert Jones a chance to respond.
Yeah. Well, thanks for those comments. The one thing that I think it points me to here is that I'm happy you're raising is there actually are differences. And again, I just want to be clear that the reasons why sort of I and most other social scientists, so this is not unique to this book, it's a pretty common practice in the social sciences to really look at religious groups by both religious affiliation and race in the country, mostly because they behave on the ground so differently. I mean, if you're in Mississippi, you know this in your lived experience as well as anyone, that you go to a white church, you go to an African American church, and then you see what those people in those churches do, particularly in political space. They look really different from one another, and that's why we study them in different categories. But the one thing I would say is that at least at the macro level, we actually do see differences here. So among like Asian American Pacific Islander churches, Latino churches are actually growing in this country. So we see those actually expanding. African American churches over the past few decades, we've seen basically holding their own. So basically kind of generational replacement, not growth, but not also great decline either. The really great decline is really among white denominations in the country, both Catholic and Protestant, by the way. It's not just a Protestant phenomenon.
All right, we are talking with Robert Jones, who is the founding CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute, also a columnist for The Atlantic, and he's talking about his new book, The End of White Christian America. Now, you pointed out on the issue of younger people that a lot of factors, including support for same-sex marriages, is driving this. In one of the charts in PRRI explains, sort of put side by side, the percentage of Americans who are white Christian versus the percent of Americans who favor same-sex marriage. And the two sort of have been reversing course, particularly during the Obama administration, whereas before there were 32% of Americans back in 2004 who favored same-sex marriage, while nearly 60% identified as white Christian. Now, nearly 60% support same-sex marriage, and 43 identify themselves as white Christian. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's a little bit of an unusual chart, right? We've got a demographic trend and an attitude trend on the same chart. But the reason why I dropped them on the same chart is because I think if you want to understand a kind of white Christian anxiety that we saw in this election cycle, and that I think Donald Trump actually tapped, that chart goes a long way toward explaining it, right? Because if you think about yourself as kind of a Republican, white Christian, or conservative, these trends are fairly fast and they're fairly alarming, right? So if you go back to, again, just 2 election cycles ago, only 4 in 10 Americans supported same-sex marriage. Right, today that's 6 in 10 Americans supporting same-sex marriage. So if you think about that, you go from 2008. If you're a conservative white Christian, you were a majority of the country demographically. A majority of the country agreed with you, likely, on the issue of same-sex marriage. And today, neither of those things are true. Right, you're no longer a majority of the country, and a majority of the country, in fact, disagrees with you on this kind of flagship issue, really, for many white evangelical Christians of gay marriage. It was a very symbolic issue, and so I think it has gone a lot to this feeling of vertigo. I think among many conservative white Christians as to what's happened in the country, and in fact I think the way it comes out for most of them is what's happened to my country is the way it comes out for many of them.
All right, Jamie's calling from Kentucky in our Democratic line. Good morning, Jamie.
Hey, good morning. Y'all okay today?
We are great. You're on with Robert Jones. Go ahead.
Okay, I am a white Christian, and I, just like the lady said earlier, though, I don't see a color when it comes to religion or Christianity. It's knowing that or believing that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior, and believing in Him, and I do. And I think that I've seen this graph, the decline, and I've seen the millennials was the decline, and it's just been getting the decline has been getting more severe as time goes on. And I think a lot of that, to me, is I think it's popular media. I feel like MTV and a lot of these, popular media, has been, I think, pushing a lot of that in a way that it takes me too long to try to explain that. But it's just, it's just like America was founded on God. And, it was founded on God. We now, to me, America is a melting pot. And for everybody, and the religion, it's like now, if you try to voice your religion, it's considered as hateful in a lot of ways, and it's just, I don't understand a lot of people's views, and like, I am a Democrat, but I was for Donald Trump, and it was basically completely based on because of I thought that he was more for the evangelicals. And here's the thing about the same sex that you all was talking about. If they think that it's so normal and right, if the world was full of same sex people, there was no way it couldn't last. There would be no reproduction. It's a contradiction itself. And I just want to say one last thing, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and every knee will bow to Him one day.
Okay, let's give Robert Jones a chance to respond.
Great. Well, thanks for that. I mean, I think it's interesting. So we had a Democrat from Kentucky, evangelical, voted for Trump, right? One of the things I think this leads to, but if you listen, so I appreciate the call. That one of the things I hear in that is, I don't understand these changes in the country. I don't like these changes in the country. And that was one of the things that pushed me to Trump. And I do think one of the things I've argued to explain maybe one of the biggest mysteries in the election was why 81% of white evangelical voters voted for Trump. It's like actually a new high water mark in support for Republican president. And one of the things I think happened there, because he doesn't really fit the so-called values voter like mold, right? He's married multiple times, doesn't really have a kind of history with churches, curses from the stump. I mean, all kinds of ways is an odd fit, and yet set a high water mark among these so-called values voters. And what I argue is that Trump was successful in basically converting values voters into being what I call nostalgia voters, right? And that is for a group of voters who were wistfully looking back, right? His "Make America Great Again," that last word "again," I think for many was the most powerful piece of this, looking back to a time when white Christian values had a kind of more control, more prominence in the country, and when things like same-sex marriage and more women in the workplace and civil rights and all that stuff, it was pre all of that stuff. And I think that's part of what happened here is that Trump was actually made this appeal to turn back the clock and to kind of turn the tide on many of these cultural changes that white evangelicals found very, very uncomfortable.
Well, let's take a look at an excerpt from your book that talks directly at that point about white Christian America's institutions. It says, in its heyday, a set of linked institutions reinforced white Christian America's worldview across generations. The Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA, the Boy Scouts, the Masonic Lodge, and the local country clubs with its limits or even outright bans on memberships for Catholic, Jews, and ethnic minorities. White Christian America has its golden age in the 1950s after the hardships and victories of World War II and before the cultural upheavals of the 1960s. June Cleaver was its mother, Andy Griffith was its sheriff, Norman Rockwell was its artist, and Billy Graham and Norman Vincent Peale were its ministers. Talk a little more about that.
Yeah, so this was I think it's in a section called The Social World of White Christian America, where I was just trying to kind of describe some texture to it. I think earlier in that same passage, to kind of tie some trends together, I also say it was a world where you could walk down the street and say Merry Christmas and not think anything of it, right? That would not be possibly offensive to someone. But I think it was a kind of, it was a very insular world. And I think it was also a world that was only visible from the inside, right? If you were white and Christian, that's what the world looked like. If you're African American, that's not what the world looked like in the 1950s for sure. But if you were white and you were Christian, you were inside that world. It was a fairly comfortable place to be. And I think as that's broken down, and particularly it's been challenged, it's been dismantled in many ways. I think that's part of, again, this kind of sense of cultural vertigo that many white evangelicals are feeling now, because many of these touchstones are just not there. Like even the YMCA is now just going by Y. It's dropped the Men's Christian Association piece of that, and you can see that in a lot of companies, or the Masonic Lodge's membership's gone way down. But I think it really is this sense of a kind of lost cultural world, and this deep sense of nostalgia that I think is driving a lot of the anxieties that we're seeing actually playing out in our politics.
All right, Floyd is calling in from Virginia on our Republican line. Floyd, you're on with Robert Jones.
Yeah, thank you for taking our call, C-SPAN. And Robert, like I say, you're really quoting Bible there, because this is the end days. We're living right now in the end days, and it said there'd be a great falling away. That's why you see it was a third of God's children followed Satan in the first earth age. 1/3 of them. So they're here now. They was born into this, see who they would follow when Satan comes back, because Satan is on his way back. I hope everybody's got a pen and they can write down a number. It's 1-800-643-4645, or they can go to www.shepherdschapel.com if they want to learn the truth, because there's a whole lot of truth that ain't being told.
Well, Floyd, do you have a question for Robert Jones?
Well, I was just commenting. You want me to comment on the comment? It's Bible. The third of God's children followed Satan. The first earth age. They're put here now in these last days to follow Satan, and they're here now. So that's the reason you see all this great falling away. And Jesus was not born in December. He was born in September. He was conceived in December for all you abortion people. You're celebrating his conception. He was born September about the 28th or 29th. So that's biblical too. And you go to that number, that website where I told you, and you can find all this information out.
Let's give Robert Jones a chance to respond.
Yeah. So the end days, right? This is apocalypse, very literally a reference to the apocalypse. I think one of the reasons why this election felt so divisive is because, in many ways, particularly I think on the conservative side of politics, it did feel kind of apocalyptic. And one survey that we had right before the election, we asked, for example, what people made of these changes, right? So the caller that we just had, his interpretation of these changes they are literally the end of the world. And we asked Americans, for example, do you think the American culture and way of life has changed for the better or changed for the worse since the 1950s? It turns out the country is evenly divided on this question. Right down the middle, half of the country thinks things have changed for the better since the 1950s. Half of the country thinks things have changed for the worse. It divides parties. 2/3 of Democrats say it's changed for the better since the 1950s. 2/3 of Republicans say it's changed for the worst since the 1950s. But there's no group who say it's changed for the worse since the 1950s who says that more than white evangelical Protestants. 3/4 of them say that things have changed for the worse since the 1950s. So, you put this biblical overlay on it, and it really is an interpretation of the end of the world, whereas Democrats are looking at all these changes and saying, no, we're actually moving into maybe even into a golden age. Things are actually getting better in the country.
So talking a little bit more about the differences between 2016 and 2012 in the election, where you had in 2012 Mitt Romney, somebody he's Mormon, but who faith was a big part of his story and his life, and he didn't say or do a lot of things that we saw Donald Trump do in the 2016 election, which neither in word nor deed really aligned with a lot of religious principles, and why still he resonated with the folks. And I want to talk a little bit about how culture and economics even plays into this. You did an interview with Jennifer Rudin from the Washington Post where you said, for many white evangelical Protestant and white working class voters, those appeals about Donald Trump's appeals about restoring a sense of place and a lost cultural world. Trump's promise is that if he is elected, the factory gates will reopen, the boards will come down off the storefront windows, the pews will fill, different races and genders will be clearly defined and will know their place, and America will make sense again. Talk about how his message differed so much from Governor Romney's and why they ended up with different results.
Yeah, well, you're right to say that, and this is one of the reasons why Romney was one of the most critical people of Trump, during the election. Seems to have buried that hatchet a little bit of late, but he gave a just scorching speech about Donald Trump, right toward the end of the election. So you couldn't get more tension than you had between these two people, and yet the vote. Again, you pull that vote chart out, it doesn't look that different. 78%, Mitt Romney gets around 78% of the white evangelical vote. Donald Trump got 81. Those aren't really different results. They're very, very similar. So a couple things. One is I think it goes to the power of partisanship, just how tribal even that for many religious groups, particularly those who are very strongly on one side or the other, for African American Protestants, being Democrat has become kind of part of their identity. And I think for white evangelical Protestants, being Republican has become very much part of their identity. So it takes a lot to pry that apart. And so I think that's part of what's going on. But then again, I think the way that Donald Trump finessed this, right, and no one's more surprised by this than Ted Cruz in the election, who really expected that evangelicals were going to be the way he beat Donald Trump. And yet, all across the South, Donald Trump handily beat him. And I think it's exactly because of this that, Cruz was kind of talking about, we're going to get religious exemptions from these gay rights laws and kind of smaller bore policy things. And Trump was saying, no, we're going to turn back the clock. So just in the same way that he promised to bring back factory jobs in Indiana or bring back coal mining jobs in Kentucky or build a wall with between the U.S. and Mexico, he was also making very explicit promises when he addressed evangelical audiences to say, I'm going to, fill the pews again. Churches are going to have more power when I am president. These are all very big promises that all cut against the grain of a lot of longstanding trends. I don't see any levers for many of them to get done. But nonetheless, if you're in that world, and one of our callers from Kentucky, if you're a conservative white Christian in Kentucky, Donald Trump hit a lot of the points that you really care about. And even if there's no immediate way that those points are going to be delivered on, he was speaking to concerns, speaking to anxieties in a way that I think Hillary Clinton was just never really able to do.
All right, Sabrina's calling in from Knoxville, Tennessee, in our independent line. Hi, Sabrina.
Hi. Now, I grew up in the Bible Belt, so I grew up with Baptist and Pentecostal, but I now practice my Native American ways. I've left the church. But the reason why that I think a lot of people have left the church is because the church is very judgmental when it comes to people being different. You have a lot of young people that are addicted to drugs and have difficult lives, and the churches aren't very understanding when it comes to that. So I think that's why the younger people have left the church. But in our country, the white Christians have always pretty much had a lot of power in our political system. But I think the reason why everybody rallied behind Trump is because our government has become very oppressive. We have a child support system that pretty much takes all of our money. We have the court system that also gets a big chunk of our money. We have our factories closing and going to other countries because we're too expensive to employ. And I think that's what America's tired of. We're tired of having blocks put in our way. We are tired of basically being beat down with an I can't stick. And when I say that, I mean, there is so many blocks in a young American's life that we have to overcome just to be able to break even. And I think that's why everybody is tired of Hillary, and that's why they voted for Trump.
Okay, let's get Robert Jones' reaction to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you hear a lot of pain, in that, and struggle. And I think that's just true. I mean, one of the things that we saw in some of our data going into the election was, the economists were all saying we're out of the recession, the economy has recovered, the jobs reports look good, and we were hearing all these kind of macro indicators that, we weren't still in the Great Recession of 2008. But when we asked everyday Americans whether they thought we were still in a recession or not, 72% of them said yes, they still think we're in a recession. And I think this great disconnect between the kind of macro indicators and what people were actually feeling on the ground in terms of economics certainly played a huge role. And so you put this kind of economic struggle, and I think one thing we're still, as she mentioned, drug addiction. I think one of the things that the sort of white middle America is experiencing that people are just getting their heads around is this opioid addiction that has decimated white working class communities in the Midwest and in the South, and particularly in rural areas. And it's broken up families, it's broken up marriages, it's just really people have lost jobs, and even the jobs that were there. So it's been a really tough time economically. And then you put on top of that these big cultural changes on top of that economic thing. And it's a pretty volatile mix. And I do think she's right. This is one of the reasons why, even if people had misgivings about Donald Trump, they reached for him, I think, as a mechanism for change, that something had to change, and maybe he might do it.
One of the charts from the book that were put together by PRRI shows the states where white Christians remain dominant with more than 60%, more than 50% of the states in the more red tinted. You see here all the way from the west, from Idaho toward most of the Midwest and most of the, I don't know you call this the near south?
Appalachia. Right?
Yes, Appalachian regions, but other states, the Carolinas, Virginia, were places where in the past I'm sure they had a much bigger stronghold. It's not so much anymore. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this map actually surprised even me a little bit, even though I've been staring at these numbers, because what that map is it's the density of white Christians. And so the states that have actually higher densities or higher proportions of white Christians aren't the Deep South, right, where you kind of think about it sometimes, but they're the upper Midwest. It's all those states. And that map has nothing to do with politics, but if you overlaid the states where Donald Trump did better than Mitt Romney did, the biggest movement are in those states. And when we actually did a correlation, we looked to see the correlations between the density of white working class people in those states and the density of white Christians in those states. And actually the stronger correlation between to Trump's vote is the density of white Christians in those states, right? So yes, it's class, but it's also culture. I think that's a really important thing to remember. And it's the upper Midwest and this kind of belt of Appalachia up, Kentucky, West Virginia, up into Pennsylvania. And those are also, the third one you could probably lay over that is opioid addiction and deaths would look pretty similar to this as well.
Okay, one of the states is Ohio, and that's where Catherine's calling from our Democratic line. Hi, Catherine.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I'm a 68-year-old white woman who was born again at 19 in a Pentecostal church. I am Pentecost, and we still believe in you must be born again. And we also believe that being filled with the Spirit is not optional. It is something that God asked us to do, to stay in Jerusalem until we were endued with power from on high, with the evidence of speaking with other tongues. Now, you can deal with it whatever you want, but I say that the day after the rapture, the churches will be completely packed to far over capacity. And the reason why we Americans have had such a great falling away is because the Bible says that we will have a great falling away. And it's nobody's fault but our own. We've allowed capitalism to be our God when we should have allowed the King, Jesus, to be our God. We followed the good old Yankee dollar instead of following the rules of Christ and what we're supposed to do for our neighbor. And yes, sir, I am my neighbor's keeper. It's my responsibility as a born-again Christian to do whatever it takes to lift up my neighbor. If that means I have to lift him up 10 times, the Bible says that I should forgive somebody for an occurrence 7 times a day for the same occurrence. And that means that I have to have a Christ-like spirit, not only in the Sunday when I go to church and I teach Sunday school, or when I take care of the nursery, or when I go in on Wednesday and teach a class, but that means also when I'm at work, when I'm at my business, when I am shopping, when I'm driving. It's
okay, Catherine, let's give Robert a chance to respond.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the kind of window, I think, into your world. And one of the things I hear at the end here is multiple touch points with church, right? When I'm at Sunday or I'm Wednesday or I'm doing volunteer activities. This is one of the things that churches have historically done. They've been a kind of social hub. And I think one of the things at the end of the book, so I begin the book with an obituary for white Christian America, but I end the book with a eulogy where I'm trying to kind of think about what does it mean, right, that if we're coming to the end of this social world. And one of I have some critical things to say about it, but one of the things that I worry a little bit about at the end of the book is that white Christian churches and Protestant churches in particular have served as kind of points of community. They've been launching pads for all kinds of charitable activities, and they've been kind of places where people have been plugged into civic engagement, even like being registered to vote and other kinds of things. And one of the things I think we're going to really have to figure out is that younger people are still less likely to vote than older people are, and as over time, historically, one of the ways that people have been plugged into civic engagement is through religious institutions. But as fewer young people are being plugged into those institutions, one real open question is, how do they get civically engaged? What are the mechanisms going to be? Because historically, they've been churches in the U.S. So I think that's still kind of an open question as to how younger people are going to organize, or not. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll kind of do more individual stuff, but there won't be this kind of institutions that will plug them in.
So this focus on white Christian America, is there any way that focus can be unhelpful? I mean, you're talking about civic engagement. There's also civic engagement done through black churches, through synagogues, through other groups, Islamic groups. Is it in any way a negative to focus just on white Christian American and not focus on faith more broadly?
Yeah. Well, I mean, every book has got to pick its focus, right? Tell in which story it's going to tell. I mean, you can't tell every story at the same time. So I think one of the things I wanted to do is to focus on this world. And the reason why I wanted to focus on this world is because it had such cultural dominance at one point, really through most of our nation's history. Right? There was a historian that I sort of use in the book who put it really starkly. He just said, look, in the middle of the 20th century, like 1940s, if you were in charge of something big and important in America, chances are you were white, you were male, and you were Protestant. Right? And that was kind of the way the world looked in the 1940s America. It's not the way it looks today. And I wanted to kind of tell the story of the kind of decline of this world and the kind of vacuum that it's left, I think, in its wake. And that's, I think, where we are in the country. And I think one of the important things that it has told is really the source of, I think, some of the anxiety that we have seen, particularly on the conservative side of politics, among white evangelical Protestants as they feel that loss of power, as they feel that loss of influence on the time. So yeah, is there another book to be written around, African-American churches and where they are? Because they're facing their own kind of dynamics in the country, or this explosive growth of Latino churches. I mean, absolutely, that's going to absolutely shift the landscape. And even in places like North Carolina, right? We don't really think about that as somewhere where there's Latino culture is really, but it is. It's a place where there's a very vibrant Latino culture today.
Okay, Susan's on our Republican line from Mississippi. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. What I wanted to address was, it sounds like there's a little bit of bias in your treatment of white Christians and the idea that they're looking for nostalgia instead, and the culture of old, when instead I think what we're looking for is a return to values that matter, that last, not just something that used to be, but something that ought to be. Does that make sense to you?
Sure. So so the thing about the book is it really is a data-based book. So there's a lot of evidence-based we haven't gotten into here, but certainly that 1950s question is a pretty stark reminder of that. Yeah, the values that last, values that matter, absolutely. In some ways, I think that's what everyone is in the country is looking for. But what I think has happened, though, and I say this as someone who's white and Christian from Mississippi myself, that for many, I think, white evangelical Christians in particular, those values are embedded in a social time and a social place, right? And they tend to be embedded backward looking, all right? And even in the language that the caller used here, she used the word return, right? It's not sort of like something new, it's something to go back to. And I think that it often gets played that way. It's revival, return, it's backward looking. That's something it's a story of loss, cultural loss. And I think that's the thing I'm really trying to hold up here to the mirror, is that it really is a story of cultural loss for many white evangelical Christians, particularly in the South, I think. And I think coming to terms with that loss is really what the book is about.
To what extent is the change attributed to, or does it involve race or even racism? I mean, you're talking about going back to a different time in the 1950s. That was a pre-Civil Rights Act. That was before the transformation that the country really had based on race and civil rights. How are those two things related?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think I came away from the book with was this sense of just how central race relations and the history of racism in the country has been for our political life and our religious life in the country. I mean, almost every denomination split over the Civil War, for example. The Southern Baptists and the American Baptists have still not reconciled, right? The American Baptists largely still up in the Midwest and the Northeast, Southern Baptists still in the South. I mean, that Southern American divide is the Civil War divide. And it was essentially over, it was actually over a missionary, whether a missionary appointed by Baptists could own slaves. And the South said, yes, they can, and the North said, no, they can't, and that was the divide. And so, and then in our politics, again, the way we get the kind of lay of the land between Republicans and Democrats is essentially the 1965 Civil Rights Act. Before that, you could find more Democrats in the South right? It used to be the solid Democratic South, and what political scientists have called the Great White Switch happened post-civil rights. The Democratic Party became identified as the party of civil rights, and whites in the South, and there was an explicit plan put in place by Republicans, the Southern strategy, to kind of attract whites using race as a wedge. I mean, so the structure of our churches, the structure of our politics is all wrapped up with the history of race in the country. And again, I'm hoping that one of the things the book does is kind of put that squarely on the agenda. I don't think there's a bridge forward without reckoning with that.
Okay, Bill's calling from Pennsylvania on our independent line. Hi, Bill.
Hello. As far as the impact on the election, I think you might term this whitewash. But my question really has to go with the polls of the young unaffiliated people. Is it ever asked of them about their parents and how strong their religious faith is? Are they regular churchgoers? Are their parents just C&E Christians? Is that ever something that's asked of the young unaffiliated?
All right, I'm going to let you answer that with just a few seconds left.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So we had a report out on this in August called Exodus, and basically in there we asked about their parents, and it actually is the second thing that makes the difference here is that if they say that their parents, and when they were raised, they were just not that religious, that's kind of the second most powerful reason why they end up not being affiliated in the next generation. So yes, absolutely. The other two factors quickly are divorce and having two parents of different religions are also factors in the next generation being more likely to be unaffiliated.
Okay, Robert Jones, author of The End of White Christian America. Thank you for joining us today and talking about your book, and Merry Christmas to you.
Thanks for having me. Merry Christmas, and I guess I should say Happy Holidays, right?
Right. All of the above, all of the above. And on tomorrow's Washington Journal, we will be joined by Linda Feldman, who will be here to discuss her recent article, How Donald Trump is Already Remaking the Presidency, and Donald Trump's effect on the Republican and Democratic parties. We will also be joined by Tevi Troy. He will be here to discuss his book, which examines how presidents respond to disasters, how their decisions can make or break their presidency, and why Americans should be prepared to handle disasters on their own instead of expecting the federal government to save the day. That's all for today's Washington Journal. We will be back tomorrow at 7 a.m. Happy holidays.